I'm Connor Ruebusch, and if you are interested in the finer points of face punching, you've come to the right place. This is Heavy Hands. Hello and welcome to another episode of Heavy Hands. I am your host, Connor Ruebusch, joined as always by Patrick Wyman, and this week we are talking about a fight that seems to kind of be flying under the radar, as well as the buffet of interesting, on the surface underwhelming, but really compelling fights that are on the undercard of this matchup. I am talking about Ryan Bader versus Anthony Rumble Johnson, probably a number one contenders fight in the light heavyweight division between one of the most feared guys in the division and one of the least respected. And I personally, Pat, I love this fight. Big fan of watching Anthony Johnson do bad things to people. Also a big fan of letting Ryan Bader surprise me and everyone who consistently picks against him. So no matter what outcome happens here, I think I will enjoy seeing it unfold.
Yeah, I mean, say what you will about Rumble outside the cage, and there's a very great deal that you can say about Rumble outside the cage. I love watching him fight. He is one of my very favorite guys to watch fight. And Ryan Bader, conversely, despite the fact that he's been saddled with the reputation of being Ryan Bader, has made consistent improvements to his game.
It's with Johnson, it's say what you will about him outside the cage. With Bader, it's you can't say anything about him outside the cage, but you got to respect what he does inside.
Yeah, Bader is not an interesting guy at all, as far as I think anybody can tell at this point. He has very little charisma. He does not do much to sell his fights. But he's a very good, very solid, very workmanlike fighter with a lot of plus skill sets. There is nothing that Ryan Bader, skill-wise, does not do well at this point, and that makes him a rough matchup for a lot of guys in a division that is not exactly stacked with kind of well-rounded talents.
Yeah, and I think there are a few things that he's pretty exceptional at. He's a pretty damn athletic guy with a really strong wrestling base. I think I've talked about this a lot on various forums, and I want to let people know, because I don't do this often enough, we will be talking about other fights later. We're going to talk about Yuri Alcantara versus Jimmy Rivera. We're going to talk about Sage Northcutt and Tarek Saffiedine, and the beauty that is Rafael Natal versus Kevin Casey, maybe the most middleweight fight of all time. So that's coming later in the show. But for now, Ryan Bader, I think it's really easy for most people to write Ryan Bader off because he is a rare case of a person who has spent most of his professional career in the UFC. He's been in the UFC since 2007, 2008,
2008, I think.
Right, and he's had a lot of fights in that time. He's fairly active, and he has lost a lot. All of his losses have been spectacular. Every single one. He's never lost by anything other than stoppage. He's looked okay in a lot of those fights that he did lose by stoppage, but he's always lost by stoppage. One of them was to Tito Ortiz, which was a pretty embarrassing 1 in a million kind of upset. And so with these fights under his belt, these losses, all being in the UFC, because he was undefeated before that. And he was on The Ultimate Fighter, came on in 2008, had his his 7th professional fight, against Vinny Magalhaes and beat him in his UFC debut after The Ultimate Fighter. But, on a surface, you can't possibly be embarrassed about having 3 of your losses be to Glover Teixeira, Lyoto Machida, and John Jones. There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing to be ashamed of. The Tito Ortiz one, kind of a weird thing. It probably would never, ever happen again, even to the Ryan Bader of that time. But because all these losses have been in front of everyone who's watched Ryan Bader on the big stage, because he's just so white bread and so plain, I think it's really easy to see him as just kind of a bad fighter who has never really been that good, who always gets knocked out every time he steps up against the elite. And so I think a good number of MMA pundits were picking against him in probably the majority of his most recent fights. I think I picked against him when he fought Ovince St. Preux, which proved to be a mistake. And you and I think we're in the minority picking him against Phil Davis, which was kind of a weird fight, but he did win. And then I think was maybe not in the minority, but it was maybe 50-50 picking him against Rashad Evans. And he's he's really proven a lot of people wrong. He's been 5-0 since 2013, and I think he's looked legitimately better, but people still have difficulty seeing him as anything other than the guy who loses whenever he steps up.
Yeah, well, it does. Yeah, I think you hit on some really important factors there. That like when Bader has lost, it has been in impressive fashion in front of a lot of eyeballs, right?
Sure.
So when John Jones, like Jones walked through him. That was not a competitive fight at all. It was on the Anderson Silva Vitor Belfort card, which had a lot of people watching it. I think that sold like 700,000 pay-per-views. And there's John Jones just drubbing undefeated Golden Boy Ultimate Fighter winner Ryan Bader. And then immediately after that, in what's supposed to be an easy bounce-back fight for him, he gets clocked with a right hand and then guillotined. Like, again, on what was a fairly high-profile card, that was the Cruz Faber card that did a pretty good buy rate and that all the hardcore fans were watching. Then he rebounds with a couple of wins. He beats an out-of-shape, not great-looking Quentin Jackson. Then he goes up there against Lyoto Machida and just gets embarrassed. That was not a competitive fight by any stretch of the imagination. I would go so far as to say it was the last time we saw, like, prime Machida. Like, that was the last time that Machida looked like the untouchable Machida, you know?
Yeah.
And so then he beats Vlad Matyushenko. He goes in there, looks pretty good for the first 2 minutes against Glover Teixeira, has Teixeira on Queerstreet, and then Teixeira just knocks his block off. Like,
yep.
And, you know, it's like when you put all those things together, and that was the main event of a pretty well-watched Fox Sports 1 event. Like, these have all come in places where there were a fair few eyeballs on, and all places where it's like, well, Bader probably should win this, or Bader should at least look better than he did. So it's like we have a really clear sense for what we think his ceiling is, even though Bader has consistently moved that ceiling upward. He's chipped away at it. He's consistently made improvements to his game. He's become a much better striker. His wrestling is as good as it ever was. He was an All-American at Arizona State. You know, Bader is a good fighter. It's just that there isn't much else aside from that. You know, there's no sense in our minds that Bader is like a champion waiting to happen.
You can't really fault the perspective either, because Bader, from a matchmaking perspective, has been used as a stepping stone. It's kind of a running joke that people get title shots off of beating Ryan Bader. You know, it's Glover Teixeira did it, John Jones did it, and Machida was supposed to get a title shot off of beating him. He was supposed to get a Jones rematch, and just it wasn't given to him. But Ryan Bader's been set up from a matchmaker perspective as a guy who, if you beat him, and yes, we expect you to do so, then you get a shot at the champion. And so that kind of firmly places him in the role of gatekeeper to the elite, but not elite himself. I think that the problem is that it prevents us from seeing that over time he has indeed gotten better, to the point where now I think he is deservedly a fixture of the light heavyweight top 5. And I don't think that'll change if he loses to Anthony Johnson, but I think that makes him competitive enough where this fight, which might have a few years ago been an easy one to pick for Johnson, now is a fight that has what I see as two very clear, predictable outcomes, which is either that Anthony Johnson makes Ryan Bader look like the Ryan Bader we've all suspected him to be, or we've all feared that he is, and maybe he fears he is, and knocks him out in the first round, or Ryan Bader shows that he has really, really come along in leaps and bounds and steadily improved, and decisions Anthony Johnson, putting all aspects of his game together. And so I'd love to talk about each of those outcomes. I mean, do you agree with me that those are basically the two ways this fight plays out, as far as we can tell?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a term in baseball for a hitter it's called a 3 true outcome hitter, whether you either strike out, you walk, or you hit a home run. And this is a 2 true outcome fight.
Sure.
Like, yeah, that those are basically the only 2 outcomes that I can really see happening, because there's no way that Ryan Bader can last on the feet for 5 rounds with Anthony Johnson without getting knocked out, I don't think.
In a lot of ways, both Ryan Bader and Anthony Johnson are 2 true outcome fighters.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
They kind of feel like 2 guys who, and those are the parameters of this fight. They each have one way to win and one way to lose, and either one of those things feels like it's going to happen.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, so with all of that said, who do you lean toward here, Connor?
I suspect that Anthony Johnson will knock Bader out. I think I've seen Ryan Bader knocked out too many times to feel confident that he won't. And I think we can talk about this in depth after you give your prediction, But I think there are some technical things wrong with Bader's striking, as wonderful as it has become, that will leave him too defensively open to keep Anthony Johnson from hitting him. But if he can stop that early, the thing is like, I think there's a 70% chance that happens in the first round. And if it doesn't, then we get to see Ryan Bader start to put together and start to employ the things that have made him such an improved fighter lately.
Yeah, it takes Bader a little while to get into his rhythm, it seems to me. That's a thing that's going to be a problem against a guy who's a quintessential definition of a quick starter in Anthony Johnson. In terms of technical flaws, let's see if we're talking about the same ones, because I think the Bader's tendency to run forward into a switch kick while leaving his head on the center line, I think is a really, really bad thing to do. You might point to Bader's jab, leaving him open to counters, but I actually like Bader's jab. I think he's tricky enough with the rhythm that it's not as easy to counter him as guys think it is.
Yeah, and he leaves his head forward and kind of falls into it, but he also steps off to an angle and pivots away as he throws it. So I think he's pretty difficult to track with that. I think that would be a mistake for him to abandon it, thinking that it's. I mean, basically, in a risk-reward relationship, it's far more valuable than it is risky.
Yeah, absolutely. But to me, the big thing is that switch kick. I don't like the way that he throws that particularly. I think when Bader commits to a combination, which he has done a lot less recently, he throws So if we're going to talk about Ryan Bader, let's talk a little bit about his transformation over his last few fights.
Sure.
He was way more of a boxer, but he's now narrowed his stance a little bit. He moves a lot more. He's lighter on his feet. I would say he's more of a pure outfighter at this point.
Yeah, and more of a kickboxer than he used to be.
Yeah. He used to be a pretty pure boxer. But yeah, no, he throws a lot more kicks now. He's a lot lighter on his feet. I think he's got a much better sense for where he is in the cage and how to use his feet to stay where he wants to be. The jab is part of that. But he gets on his bike quite a bit. He moves well, moves nicely. But he doesn't really sit down on combinations anymore. He throws a lot of single shots.
Yes.
It's single shots at a high pace, but it's single shots nonetheless. So he's producing volume, but it's a very particular kind of volume.
What I see in Ryan Bader is what happens when a smart coach or a smart team of coaches have an athletically gifted fighter who is essentially set in his ways. That when he came up as a fighter, he developed certain flaws, and it's just not worth it to try and get rid of him at this point. So when Bader throws power, he's going to lunge forward. He's going to leave himself open. He doesn't know any way other than to throw punches as if he's shooting for a double leg. You know what I mean? He's going to throw his full weight forward and go for it. And so the change is not in, okay, we're really going to fix your punching mechanics. The change is in, we're going to change when you think it's okay to do that. And so what they've done is basically taken Bader with his flaws and done the best they can with him strategically to hide them and to make them as difficult to capitalize on as possible. So now instead of throwing lots of combinations, Bader will only throw those combinations when he is sure that you're open for them after he has tenderized you and set you up and make you jumpy with his jab. And his jab really is fantastic. And it's not just that it's a great technical punch, because it's not perfect from that perspective, but Bader has always had good timing, which is why he was always able to be pretty successful with his striking, despite being not a great technical boxer. And he's got great shot takedowns for the same reason. So now we take that natural ability to time an opponent and to shoot and to hit them off rhythm and minimize the risks associated with attacking it. Just go for one thing, don't look for the knockout, and then you'll find the openings later in the fight.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I like that you drew the connection there between Bader's reactive takedowns and his jab, because you're absolutely right. It is the same skill set to be able to pick exactly the right moment, either to change levels and drop under and hit a double leg, which is, I think Bader has maybe one of the 2 or 3 best reactive doubles in all of MMA.
Sure.
He is a tremendous double leg artist. I think he's got as close to a technically perfect double leg as we see in MMA from maybe anybody other than maybe Mighty Mouse or old school Georges St. Pierre. But it's a great takedown, but it's great because he knows how to get himself in on his hips. Like, you look at Ryan Bader shoot that takedown and you think, oh, Bader's an incredible athlete. He's really explosive. And that's true. But you look at where he starts that takedown, how he gets himself in on the hips in the first place, and the drive and explosiveness is no less impressive, but you gain a greater appreciation for how he got himself there in the first place. Like, he really excels at using his strikes to distract from his takedowns, at timing his level changes under his opponent's strikes, using the combination of his jab and his double leg in interesting ways. Like, it's a complete game. It's limited in particular ways. Like, there is not a great breadth of skill there, of technique there, but it works for what he wants it to do.
Yeah, and I think he's broadened his skills in the right way. As risky as we both think the kicks are, I think it's valuable for him to have that as an option from long range. I think it can be very effective to work a switch kick off of a jab. That's a really tricky thing to catch onto. When the left hand extends, you might think it's the jab. You raise your hand to parry, and then the kick comes under your ribs. It's just reliant on the opponent waiting for and reacting to that jab. So the jab has to make him jumpy first, and Bader often, at least in the Rashad Evans fight, he went for that kick really often before the jab was fully established. He was really focused on mixing the two, but I think the one is more dependent on the other than vice versa. You know what I mean? At least in terms of risk. Obviously, a left kick is a lot riskier. You're in a lot more trouble if you get hit while kicking than you are while throwing a jab.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. But we've discussed this before. My great pet peeve are kicks that aren't set up by anything that involve you keeping your head right on the center line.
Yeah.
Like, and Bader is a terrible offender at that. So if you don't distract with anything, and he throws them naked. He throws them with no setup, nothing, without even stepping into them, really.
He checks hands as he throws them a lot, but that's not a surefire way to keep from being punched.
Well, it's not I think it's a genuinely crappy strategy against anybody who has even a semblance of counterpunching skill.
Sure.
Like, we've praised Ryan Bader. Let's not go too far off the deep end here.
Yeah.
I think it's still a genuinely shitty strategy. But
and I think both of us can agree that's the major thing we see. I mean, I'm sure both you and I can see Ryan Bader stepping into a left kick. Anthony Johnson is not yet convinced that he needs to back up when he sees that left hand come out and just rams a right hand through his chin and knocks him out early.
Yeah, and that's essentially what I think is going to happen here. I mean, so we've talked a lot about Ryan Bader, but what do you think, Connor, makes Anthony Johnson an elite fighter? Like, what skill-wise? Because we can talk all day about Johnson's athleticism and especially his power, but there's also a really crafty technical game lying underneath all that, and one increasingly so over the last few years since he's been working a lot with Henry Hooft. Like, what stands out to you the most about his game?
I'm interested to talk about both of these guys' limitations, too. So I want to just put that in our heads so we can remember to do that after this. But obviously, I think everybody celebrates Anthony Johnson for being strong and athletic and explosive and all of these things. The things that people tend to pick up on are attributes more than skills. But he is a really skilled fighter and a uniquely skilled one. We talked a lot last week, or maybe it was the week before, about pressure fighting and why it has kind of taken over as the current in metagame in MMA right now. And Anthony Johnson's a great example of why that is. You give him a guy like Alexander Gustafsson, or Ryan Bader, I expect will be very similar, who is a good outside mover and who knows how to throw his opponent's timing off and knows how to use his length, but doesn't actually have perfect footwork for escaping from tight corners. And Anthony Johnson can basically just take away everything that makes that fighter effective against everybody else they face, because he's exceptionally good at cutting off the octagon in kind of an MMA-specific way, where he's happy to switch stances. He's really, really happy to use sweeping strikes like leg kicks and looping punches from either side. And he absolutely no fear about squaring up in front of his opponent because his defense is actually a lot better than advertised. And he has a hair trigger with those counters. Now, there's obviously a gambit because Anthony Johnson's gotten in trouble a lot in the past, and again recently against Daniel Cormier, when his attempt to get the guy out of there early with those hair trigger counters didn't work. Jimmy Rivera, who we'll talk about later, has a similar style of countering the moment that he sees an opening. The moment you try to attack him and miss, he'll throw 3-4 punches back at you. But Jimmy Rivera showed in his fight with Pedro Munoz that he's a far better adapter, and he can change that approach when things don't go his way. I'm not sure Anthony Johnson has that or maybe will ever have that, but all of the things I listed make him really, really effective if you give him the respect he wants you to give him early in the fight.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, I really want to emphasize this, that Rumble is a really, really good counterpuncher, and he's a really, really good defensive fighter.
Yeah.
Like, he is very, very difficult to hit cleanly, and he's very difficult to hit cleanly without eating a face full of leather in return.
Right.
So it's genuinely dangerous, because it's not just that Rumble pressures; it's that he's constantly slipping his head off the center line very subtly as he moves forward. So you plant your feet to throw back at him. Well, his weight is already loaded back to the side. to come back with a counter shot. It's a very, very Dutch style kind of thing that he does. Like, we've talked before about the hallmarks of the Dutch style, but that kind of constant weight transfer and shifting and head moving in preparation to throw something back for a half beat counter, I think is the most quintessential thing about the Dutch style. If you take away what the actual strikes are, you take away the shot selection. Most people, when they think Dutch style, they think punch kick combinations, especially low kicks, especially punches followed by low kicks. I think the most quintessential thing is that constant half-beat movement back and forth that readies you to throw something. And Johnson embodies that. He really, really embodies that. I think more than anybody else at the Black Zillions, I would say that he is Henry Hooft's prize student. And I think you see a lot of the fundamentals of what Hooft teaches in Johnson's game. But those half-beat counters are the primary thing. It's not easy to hit Johnson as he pressures. Like, that's kind of the problem with pressure fighting in general, is that it constantly leaves you out there to be hit. Johnson is kind of the exception to that, man. It's not easy to get your hands on him. He's long, he's rangy, he checks hands well, he parries strikes really well. His head is rarely on the center line. Like, it's not easy to get him.
Yeah, the thing I like about Anthony Johnson is that even though he is an aggressive fighter, he almost never feels like he has to have his hands next to his head.
No, huh?
So he's a great teachable example of the value of head movement and footwork as defense. And he doesn't have a super wide array of head movements, of upper body movements. It's mostly just simple slips and pulls, where he's creating space and pulling his head over one hip, and usually both at once. But he does this really well and knows the range in which he has to do it, because he's constantly touching his opponent. He's always got often both hands out there on the opponent's gloves, touching their head, kind of like a wrestler. And he takes that wrestler's approach to distance management so that he is always just a short step away, or if the opponent leads, he's right in position to pull his head slightly out of the way and come back with a powerful shot. So he's a blast to watch from a technical perspective. He really is. Not always like perfectly technically clean, but he does things at the right times in the right ways. He's a tactically brilliant fighter, and it's so thrilling to watch. I think his limitations, like Bader's, are kind of more mental than physical. I think Anthony Johnson's one of those fighters where when he was sucking down to welterweight and losing all of this weight, it was really easy to say, oh, he's got bad stamina, he's going to be better when he stops cutting weight. And it may have improved some, but I think we saw in that Daniel Cormier fight that it wasn't really the weight cut so much as it was the mentality and the losing of confidence that caused Anthony Johnson to lose his cardio so many times in his welterweight career. Would you agree with that?
Well, I think Rumble is the quintessential front runner, right?
Sure.
And this is, we've talked about a lot of guys like this where their game is built, and Alistair Overeem too, I think is a lot like this, where they need to be successful right out the gate, and they can win decisions. This doesn't mean that they can't win decisions. It just means that they had better be successful right off the bat, because their confidence builds like a freight train.
Sure. Well, you give him the fight with Phil Davis. He's got a guy who looks like he's running scared the entire time. Anthony Johnson looked flawless in that fight all the way through. He never looked like he was getting tired. He looked fine. Even a tough fight like the Andrei Arlovsky one, which is relatively back and forth, he always felt like he had an answer. But then you give him the fight against Daniel Cormier, and it was almost exactly like his fight with Josh Koscheck 6 years before. And I think it's a matter of how you respond when Anthony Johnson puts his hands on you, because I think anybody in this division will be a fool to think that he's not going to lay hands on you at some point. And so you have to really, really mentally prepare yourself when fighting Rumble to react appropriately when he does that, and to teach him a lesson the moment that he has success, rather than making it look like an opportunity for him to follow up. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. And Cormier did.
Yes.
Cormier absolutely did.
He completely shut him down the moment he got hit.
Yeah, I mean, well, and Cormier, I don't think that we can overstate this, because it's important to give Rumble his due from that fight. Rumble put a lot of leather on Cormier's face.
Yes.
He knocked him down was it the first minute of the fight he knocked him down?
The first 30 seconds of the fight, yeah.
Yeah, he knocked him down. He landed a bunch of flush head kicks. Like, Rumble came as close as any man has or probably will in the near future to knocking out Daniel Cormier. And it's a testament to Cormier. It takes tremendous durability and strength of character almost to get through the kind of beating that Rumble was in the process of putting on Cormier. And so, if you have that, if you can get through Rumble's storm, if you can start to make him question who he is and what he's doing out there, then he's beatable. I don't know that's not like a unique character flaw. We're not saying like, oh, Rumble is somehow lacking in the deepest wells of his soul because of this. A lot of fighters are like this. A lot of fighters are front runners.
We did prognosticate a little before, wondering if maybe this is something that a mentality that the Black Zillions feed rather than trying to diminish. This idea that you can like macho your way out of tough situations. And maybe we see that from guys like Abel Trujillo as well, who has a little bit of the same thing going on. Maybe we see it from Rashad Evans. When he fought Ryan Bader, he seemed to lose heart in that fight and has often done so before. So maybe there's a bit of a macho thing going on there that is not being helped. But it's not like, again, those are 3 examples from that gym. It's obviously not a special thing for Anthony Johnson. He is a very typical type of fighter, and that is, as you said, a front runner or a bully. A guy who and I would hope that any trainer would see that and try to have some kind of strategy for dealing with it. My question is, in this fight, how much of Ryan Bader's lack of durability has actually been a result of his own mental deficiencies, and can he have corrected that? Obviously, you can't improve your chin really over time, but can he have corrected what seems to be a fragile chin by becoming a more confident striker?
See, I don't think that it's so much a problem with Bader's chin as just that he's in a division full of guys who hit with some power. And when Bader manages to get himself hit, he gets himself hit really hard.
Well, that's what I'm talking about, because Bader's problem was not necessarily that he was getting hit by things that wouldn't have hurt someone else and going down. His problem was that he was putting himself in places to get hit hard, often running straight into that shot.
Yeah, the Machida knockout is the quintessential one, right?
Yeah.
Where he just ran face first into a Machida. I think it was a right hand, wasn't it?
Yes. Machida blocked with the left and threw a right hand from Orthodox. It looked as if you just hung a steel girder from a chain and had a guy run at full speed into it.
Yeah, that's essentially what happened there. And what was the other Bader knockout? The Teixeira one was when he was exchanging with Teixeira. Teixeira had his back to the fence, and Bader was just swinging away with his right hand like he was trying to fell lumber.
Yes,
and Teixeira clocked him,
squared his feet, flinging his right hand over and over. Very, very predictable after having hurt Teixeira. It was maybe seemed like a thing where Bader had started to believe that he would never break through and beat an elite fighter. He suddenly saw the opportunity before his eyes and really, really got hungry for it. And he got really greedy and got knocked out.
Yeah, so see, in the context of this particular matchup with Anthony Johnson, I have a hard time seeing how Bader can keep himself out of those situations because Rumble is longer. Rumble is very defensively sound. Bader is going to have to throw to put himself out there, not just to score points on the feet, but also to set up his wrestling game, which I'm sure he's going to want to use. So he's going to have to, in order to be in the fight, create opportunities for Anthony Johnson as a counterpuncher. And I just don't see how Bader escapes those without finding himself on the canvas. So I like Johnson to knock him out.
I think so too, but the one caveat I have here is that I don't see Ryan Bader running into a shot the same way he did against Lyoto Machida. He doesn't tend to chase after fighters with those combinations, desperately trying to land that big right hand anymore. He throws more lead rights now than he does big marching, shifting punch combinations, and has a little more cleverness to his timing. So that's why this fight's interesting to me. Obviously, we both pick Anthony Johnson. I don't want to make it sound like I'm chickening out on that pick because I see what you see, but. Man, if Bader gets past his first round, I can't tell you how tickled I will be to see him beat a top 3 heavyweight.
Yeah,
light heavyweight.
I just had one more comment on this.
Yeah.
The parallel that people are drawing between the kind of game plan that Cormier was able to execute, where he just wore Johnson down in the clinch and from the top ride and on the mat before he eventually sunk in the choke. Like Bader has a great ride. But Bader is not the same kind of control wrestler that Cormier is.
No.
I don't think it can be overstated how good Cormier is in those positions. Like, Cormier was legitimately one of the best freestylers in the world in those positions.
With the back takes and the waist lock and the dragging you down, that's what he did as a freestyle wrestler.
Yeah, like, Cormier was legitimately one of the best in the world and was a favorite to win a medal in Beijing before his kidneys failed, doing exactly that against world-class competition. While Bader was a good collegiate wrestler, Cormier was world class. And so I think drawing that parallel between what Cormier did and how Bader could do something similar, yeah, I guess the blueprint's there, but don't undersell how good Cormier is at those things.
It is
how
also
good you have to be to make them work.
It is also hard to imagine, however, Ryan Bader failing as spectacularly to wrestle Anthony Johnson as Phil Davis did.
Well, no, very different kinds of wrestlers, right?
He's much better in that kind of range where he can try to fight defensively and still hit takedowns.
Yes, absolutely. He is much, much better at that than Phil Davis was. Where Phil Davis was a guy who doesn't have an explosive shot. Like, for all the talk about Phil Davis as an explosive wrestler, he's really not an explosive guy. He needs to get his hands on you and then he can chain.
Yeah.
Bader can hit clean doubles on you in space because he's explosive, he's got great drive, and he's got great timing in a way that Phil Davis never did.
Sure. Yeah.
But so just had a few comments there about the wrestling matchup here.
Yeah, and I think that's a fascinating aspect of it. I mean, Bader was competitive with Phil Davis in the short range wrestling. Mm-hmm. He is a good close range wrestler. He's just not a controlling wrestler in the same way Daniel Cormier was.
Yeah, well, he can suffocate you, but we've never seen Bader do that to a defensive wrestler of Johnson's caliber.
Sure.
Sure. Like, I just let's look at who has Bader wrestled to death in that fashion. Fei Zhao, Ovin St. Preux. He wrestled a little bit with Phil Davis, but Anthony Johnson is an infinitely better defensive wrestler than Ovin St. Preux ever will be.
He's not
infinitely
Anthony
better
Perosh or Vladimir Matyushenko, the guys that he has really smothered. But what happens? I keep having questions here, but I tell you, I really like this matchup. What happens if Anthony Johnson gets in his head to wrestle Ryan Bader? Because I think Johnson is quite used to mixing his wrestling in with his striking as well. He did it to Jimmy Manuwa. He did it a strange amount against Daniel Cormier when they fought. Like, he felt like he had to one-up Cormier and go for takedowns himself and jump into the clinch. Or maybe he was looking to rest. So what happens if Anthony Johnson tries to wrestle with Bader? Because I think Bader is a sorely underrated defensive wrestler. He's very difficult to take down.
Well, I think if you're Johnson, you don't want to get into a mat wrestling battle with Ryan Bader. There's no question in that kind of fight, if Bader can get this down to the mat and get into transitions and scrambles and position and those kinds of wrestling specific mat positions, then there's no question that Bader is better than Rumble. The problem is going to be for Bader getting it there in the first place. If Johnson can keep his space or keep it in the clinch, I think Johnson is a much better clinch fighter.
The short
than
punches
Bader
in the
is.
clinch. He's pretty much a terror when he's in that short to mid range.
Yeah, if he can keep it there, if he can keep Bader off of his hips and keep both knees off the mat, then I think Johnson is going to be fine. But if Bader can create those kinds of transitions, well, then baby, we got a stew going.
Absolutely. I don't even know what to do with that reference. I'm just too happy about it.
That's Carl Weathers in Arrested Development.
I know that. I know the reference. I am completely lost for words. I can't possibly top it. So why don't we end the segment on that note? Now that we've got a stew going, let's take a break. When we come back, we're going to talk about Yuri Alcantara versus Jimmy Rivera. A fantastic fight in the bantamweight division. And then just all the questions we have about Sage Northcutt and Tarek Safadine, two fighters who are very interesting to watch and very interesting to talk about for very different reasons. So all of that after this. Hey everybody, thanks for listening to this week's Heavy Hands. If you like what you hear, please consider pledging to support the podcast on Patreon. Patreon is basically continuous crowdfunding. You sign up to contribute a certain amount per month to help us with production costs and the like, and in return you get rewards ranging from a mention on the Heavy Hands website to a question or topic of your choice being discussed on the show. We have a lot more in the works to reward you for your help, and we appreciate every contribution. No amount is too small. Just head over to patreon.com and find how you can help out the only show dedicated to the finer points of face punching. Now let's get back to it. Alright, so next up on the docket we have a bantamweight fight that I think is kind of the sleeper matchup on this card. That's Yuri Alcantara versus Jimmy Rivera. Two weird kind of dark horses in this division. They're the opposites in a lot of ways. And as somebody who likes fiction as well and classic boxing journalism and things like that, I'm attracted to fights that have narratives like this, Pat, where I think if I look at this, I find it really easy to put Alcantara and Rivera in opposite categories in a lot of ways. Go on.
I think you hit on the basic dynamic of this fight, and that is that these guys really are opposites.
Right.
They're both highly skilled, both very good fighters who have yet to get their due at the top of the bantamweight division, but very opposite. So Alcantara is really tall. In every way, these guys are opposite. So Alcantara is really tall for the division. He's huge for the division. He's 5'9". Rivera is, I think, generously listed at 5'4". Alcantara is a one-hitter quitter kind of guy who throws big power into pretty much everything he puts out there.
Yeah.
And Rivera, despite having a really muscular build, despite being built really thick, is a high-volume, high-output kind of striker. He routinely throws 2, 3, 4 times as much as Alcantara would over the course of a minute.
Alcantara is an aggressor or a pot shotter. Rivera prefers to hang back and counter. And Alcantara, I think, is tragically tactical, where he gets really, really caught up in what's going on right in front of him, which means he will engage in a to-the-death firefight if somebody tags him early in a fight. He will go for a flying knee or an armbar from the back rather than locking down a position or controlling distance and setting up a shot. He is always going for the kill. And he's got 25 of his 32 wins are by finish, so he's pretty successful, all things considered. But Rivera, I think, has in the past been a tragically strategic fighter, where he often, despite being a powerful hitter, an accurate combination puncher, and what we've seen now from him for almost 4 straight fights in a row before his really entertaining battle with Pedro Munoz. Before that point, when he got 4 KOs in a row, he was 3 KOs in a row, I guess. He was kind of a decision machine, where he was really happy to grind his opponents out and not take risks and use his wrestling to stall more mobile fighters, which is something that Yuri Alcantara would never dream of doing. He's definitely not like his brother Ildemar. If the two of them, Yuri is the crazy killer one who like Ildemar would calmly talk you down and Yuri would wait till you leave the bar and stab you in the parking lot. That's his mentality in a fight. So we have a real dichotomy here that makes this fight really interesting.
Yeah, and Rivera is the rare American prospect in this day and age who really accumulated a ton of experience on the regional scene before he got to the UFC.
Yeah.
In large part, I think because his style was so anti-finish that just gave him a lot of time to get really good against not elite competition. You can see how there's a world in which Jimmy Rivera gets signed to the UFC back in 2012 and gets tossed into the deep end and never becomes this kind of accurate combination puncher who's defensively sound, exciting, and mechanically sound all at the same time,
which is good. I mean, I think the MMA world could learn a lot from the boxing world in letting prospects develop. I don't want to see it get to the point where you have 30 fights against nobodies before you ever step up against competition and then you just sit out and wait for big money fights. But I like the fact that Rivera allowed aspects of his game to develop that most fighters his age, he's only 26, don't have in MMA today. The head movement and the defense, the footwork, the mind for strategy and where he is in the cage and where he is in the whole story of a fight. He knows how to steal around if he has to. He's a smart fighter. His game is tailored for winning fights. And now he's getting to the point where he's also experienced enough to let go and be more dangerous. So that debut against Marcus Brimage, he blew Brimage out of the water, and he got similarly devastating KOs in both of the fights before that. He came close to getting a similar KO in that fight with Pedro Munoz, and then got hurt, and then dialed it back and won a smart, educated split decision. So I think he's close to being, if not a finished product, a complete product that can continue to be refined at only the age of 26, which gives him great potential.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's only a matter of time until Rivera is gracing the top 10. And I believe that Brian Stan, in commentating on that Rivera Munoz fight, said that he thought that both of them were top 15 fighters pretty much already. Yeah. Right. That and I think that Stan was absolutely right about that. Like, the bantamweight division right now is, I would say, going to be the one to watch over the next 2 to 3 years, not only because of the rising talent in the UFC, guys like Rivera, Aljamain Sterling, Tomas Almeida, even John Lineker, you want to throw him in that category, but also because of the amount of talent that's coming up outside the UFC as well. Like the prospect list that Scott Harris and I just finished up last week, is just stacked with bantamweights. There are a ton of good guys coming up. It's going to be one of the staple divisions of the UFC for a long time to come. And guys like Rivera are why. It's easy to too, not just how in another world Jimmy Rivera is signed to the UFC as a bantamweight in 2012, but if he were a lightweight or a welterweight, he would have been signed in 2011. You know,
Sure.
An American guy who would be 9-1 or 10-1 never makes it to 16-1 on the regional scene in the U.S. before he gets signed.
Yeah, absolutely. So how do you think this fight plays out? What's your read on it?
I like Rivera here. I'm just almost always, when you put this situation in front of me, going to take the higher output guy, the volume guy, especially because Rivera's tough. Rivera's pretty defensively sound. Despite the size disadvantage, I don't see any way really for Alcantara to get him to the mat. I think Alcantara is the better grappler, but Rivera has really stunningly good takedown defense, like ridiculous takedown defense.
Yeah. It helps, but his frame certainly helps with that.
Yeah, there's just no way, especially for Alcantara, a guy who really depends on clinch takedowns, there's going to be no way for him to get his hips below Rivera's in the clinch to get the kind of takedowns that he wants.
Yeah.
So I think that means this probably plays out in the clinch and is a striking matchup. And in that scenario, I have a hard time not going with the cleaner combination striker, especially given the fact that Alcantara is not like a guy who wants to set a long distance. Alcantara wants to kill. And Alcantara does that best when he's leaping forward into strikes, which creates a lot of opportunities for counters.
That's the thing, and I think that will be a key factor in this fight, is that Alcantara does have the reach advantage, and he does like to fight from a long range, but he fights from that range by leaping across it. He's not a guy who maintains the distance while he's attacking and keeps you on the end of his jab and sticks out a long 1-2. He's got a lot of great long weapons, good front kick, good left high kick and body kick, a good straight left. He'll switch stances and attack from both, but he's typically lunging across that space. And I think that leaves just too many opportunities for the counter puncher and the counter wrestler in Jimmy Rivera. It is interesting, however, that you talk about Rivera as a volume puncher, because he always throws in combinations, I think he's one of the few guys that comes to mind as almost purely a counter striker. There are not many of them in MMA, but Rivera doesn't tend to pressure all that much unless he gets you in a clinch and he'll press you against the cage. But in terms of where he likes to be, given space between himself and his opponent, he is typically not controlling the center, and he is typically waiting for you to attack and then responding. He's got hair trigger counters, so he doesn't wait a lot, and he throws a lot of punches and often follows those punches with kicks when he does counter. But he is a counter fighter. So I think we will actually see Alcantara having more control over the pace than usual, where maybe he can keep his distance and pot shot if he can convince himself to do it. The thing is, I don't know that Alcantara can rein in that killer instinct of his.
See, I agree and I disagree with that. I agree that that Rivera is a really defined counterpuncher, but I disagree in that he would still let Alcantara dictate the pace. I think because unlike most defined counterpunchers, it seems to me that Rivera does a really good job of filling up the space in between those counter combinations with activity, of throwing inside low kicks, starting combinations with low kicks to draw out a response, and then countering off of that, counter, measuring distance with the jab. I think, unlike most counterpunchers, he does a good job of making things happen and doesn't just sit back and wait.
It kind of seemed to me in the Pedro Munoz fight that it wasn't a natural thing for him to do that, though. His corner, I think, had to remind him to up his activity. Because in the second round, when he started to be tagged, he became very, very reactive, which you can say is a great survival tactic, not to go out there swinging when Munoz dropped him twice in that round, or stung him once and then dropped him with the second clean punch he landed. But it wasn't until the start of the third round, I think, that Rivera actually came out and started pumping his jab again and giving Munoz things to react to and setting up his counters.
Yeah, that's a fair point. But there are two ways to look at that particular sequence, right? One is to say that that he was in survival mode, and when he was in survival mode, he reverted to doing only what he was most comfortable with,
right?
In order to limit exchanges and the chance for him to get hurt again. Or the other way is to. Actually, I guess that's both things right there. That either it was a survival strategy or getting tagged reverted him to being a not as good version of himself who was totally reactive.
Well, I don't think it's totally bad for a counterpuncher to go into hardcore counter mode when they get hit either. We know Juan Manuel Marquez does that, and he turns into a murderous knockout puncher when he's hurt, because he zeroes in and becomes so focused on countering you and teaching you a lesson for having hurt him. And Rivera may very well be the same way. But that tendency to wait, I think, will give Alcantara some opportunities. So hopefully we're in for a fun fight here. I do agree with you, however. I think Rivera is a pretty easy pick, relatively easy. But should be a good matchup. I like both guys, and Alcantara is just crazy enough to be a wild card in any matchup. So I'm interested to see how it plays out. Now, happening just before that, I think the opening bout on the main card, Sage Northcutt is fighting at welterweight against a short notice replacement in Bryan Barberena. First of all, I do want to say, I think it's a little silly that there are people out there trying to call out Sage Northcutt and accusing him of taking easy fights, because the man is 19. It's hard to even say the man, because he is in so many ways a boy. He is very young, very inexperienced, has only 7 fights, all of them against pretty poor competition. Cody Pfister being the best on that list. And when Cody Pfister, no offense to him, is the best fighter you've ever faced, you haven't faced a lot of great fighters. And so I think Bryan Barberena is right around the right level of fighter that Sage Northcutt should be fighting here, because Barberena is tough. He has finishing potential. He is pretty dangerous in some transitional phases that a younger fighter like Northcutt might have yet to really pick up on. So he has some openings, but he's not an exceptional fighter who has a clear-cut path to victory, so it makes him a test that is beatable. And I think that's what you should be giving to a guy like Sage Northcutt, who has all of this star potential.
Yeah, I fundamentally agree with that. Like, I really genuinely don't understand a lot of the hate that's directed at Sage Northcutt. Like, when the UFC offers him $40,000 to show and $40,000 to win in his second fight with the promotion, which is a ton of money, do you expect him to say, no, I don't want this money that you're offering me?
He should be too good for that, right?
Yeah, like, that's stupid. That's a stupid line of reasoning. If you want to be mad at somebody, be mad at the UFC in the way that they present him, because otherwise he seems to be a nice, if somewhat oddball 19-year-old whose social media presence is just stunningly fun to me.
Yeah,
I love it.
He's absolutely fun.
About it.
He's so enjoyable, whether ironically or genuinely. Like, no matter how you view him, he's a lot of fun to have around. And yeah, obviously the UFC didn't make a misstep picking the guy up, because he's proven to be quite popular for having done essentially nothing in the sport so far.
Yeah, but he offers an interesting opportunity to talk about how you develop prospects and what you want to see from prospects at various stages of development, and B, just what athleticism means in this sport. Because right now, like, yeah, sure, Northcutt was a world karate champion or whatever, but really he is getting by on his athletic gifts. He is an unbelievable world-class athlete. Yeah. He is a better athlete at this stage of his career than Georges St-Pierre was back in 2001 or back in 2002 when he debuted. Like, because the first thing that jumped off the screen at you with Georges St-Pierre when you watch those early fights is how smooth he is, how put together he looks. And Northcutt, very similarly, I think, is exactly the same thing. That more so than any particular skill set that he has, what jumps out at you is his ability to move, the way that he looks in the cage, his speed. And all the rest of that, all those skills, those are teachable. You can teach those to a guy. But that physicality, man, you cannot teach that. Yeah,
I made the same exact comparison. I think a lot of people probably have, but I made it in my Sherdog preview that's coming out this weekend. I think it's funny the fact that Northcutt has been working at TriStar, because obviously Firas Zahabi knows what to do with a fighter with that kind of talent. Because he is so similar to Georges St-Pierre. And while that may ultimately mean Sage Northcutt turning into a less fun fighter, it will very likely mean Sage Northcutt turning into a phenomenally good fighter, because he has that kind of potential. And I think this fight's a really interesting place for him to develop. I think, more than anything, I think Barberena is dangerous in the clinch with elbows and short strikes, and that is the kind of thing I think we will have to see Sage Northcutt have some hiccups with. As he develops, because I think we saw in that fight with Cody Pfister, which was just a fun fight. If you watched the embedded on that, it was like the kid in the Slayer shirt who was never cool, i.e. Cody Pfister, hating, like, having this misguided hatred for the guy who was like pretty and popular but had never wronged anybody, i.e. Sage Northcutt. Like, Sage Northcutt was his replacement for all of the bullies, even though Sage Northcutt was just popular because he's so nice. You know what I mean? But in that fight, it was like two guys just making tons and tons of technical mistakes, particularly on the ground. We saw a lot of Pfister putting his hands on the mat, reaching back to open the guard, all these things that are problems. But what we saw especially was Sage Northcutt not knowing how to capitalize on those. And I think that is a thing that that it really clues you in on how much technical development he still needs. That maybe he was a little overawed by Pfister's pressure and aggression and couldn't react the way he probably expected to given his training as a result.
Yeah, like, it's worth pointing out, what does it look like Northcutt actually knows how to do and do well? So we know he seems to move fairly well at range. We know that he's got a nice kind of disruptive side kicking game. We know he throws just brutal round kicks when given the opportunity to do so.
Good timing, I think, overall, both on the strikes and the shot takedowns.
Yeah, which is kind of a product of his athleticism, right?
Sure.
Like, you just see things faster, and you can react faster. To all of that. So we know that he can do that, but. Despite his karate credentials, whatever you think of those, he is at heart a transitional wrestle grappler, right? That, like, what he does well is picking his spots to shoot an explosive, well finished double legs, and then when you try and move under him, he spins around to your back, takes your back, or he looks for a guillotine, or he just wails away with punches. Like, he's got a really naturalistic sense of how to combine strikes, takedowns, and submissions, that he's really great in those in-between spaces. And it's really not an uncommon thing at all to see those really gifted athletes be good in those spaces.
Yes.
So if he can put Barberena in those spaces, then he's got a good chance at winning the fight. But if he lets Barberena push him into the clinch, especially push him up against the fence, then I think it's going to be an ugly night for young Sage.
Well, and maybe like GSP, it'll be a matter of learning to find those opportunities under duress. Because I think what we saw in that Pfister fight was kind of, yes, Northcutt can eye these openings in transition when it's kind of a game to him. When it's like it turns into more of a point-finding competition. The other guy's reacting, they're both at range, he's allowed to move freely. But when Pfister is running after him and throws him into the fence and walks through one of those side kicks and doesn't respect it, Northcutt gets taken down pretty easily. And when he's on the mat and Pfister is grinding his head into his chin and just pummeling away with short punches, he's not throwing up his legs and attacking submissions like he would if the other guy was just trying to survive. And so it'll be interesting. I think that's what I'm going to be trying to pay attention to as we watch Northcutt take these kind of fights. I think it is fortunate for him that he's fighting Barberena. I think I probably would have picked the original opponent, Andrew Holbrook, to beat Sage Northcutt as being a really good, dangerous, transitional grappler himself. Barberena is a little more one-dimensional, a little more reliant on the striking, and a little less clear-cut. More of a power puncher who tends to get finishes because he's opportunistic, not a guy with a clearly defined path to victory against most opponents. So
it's an interesting matchup because it's the perfect prospect matchup, right? Like,
sure.
A guy like Barberena, who above all else, like, leaving aside his skills, is just durable and tough and has good cardio and is going to come after Northcutt the whole fight. Like, Pfister, after a certain point, like, that was what Pfister had to offer.
Yeah.
And Barberena has layers to his pressure. He has layers to his game. He's got his durability is off the charts. He's really hard to finish. Like, guys like Chad Laprise and who did he fight before? Joe Ellenberger hit him with literally everything they had. And I think that both of those guys probably have a little more to offer at range than Northcutt does. The Northcutt does at this point. Like, so if he thinks that a couple of side kicks are going to stop Barberena from getting in on him, then he's got another thing coming.
Right. I think it'll be Northcutt's explosive wrestling that saves him here, but I really would not be surprised. Barberena is the kind of guy who you match up your fighter when you're trying to decide what stage he's at. He's a test fighter. He's dangerous, and he will be there for the entire fight unless you do something definitively put him away. He also fights out of the MMA lab. I think John Crouch is really, really good at having guys come in on short notice and still having them be strategically viable. So I think it's a really fascinating matchup, more so than I think a lot of people are giving it credit for. So I'm looking forward to it. I'd like to see where Sage Northcutt's at, be keeping my eye on him as he develops, and he's just so fun. So how can I not want to watch him fight and then hear his post-fight interviews and see him doing ridiculous, silly flips after the fights? Gotta love it. So that went a little long. Why don't we take another break? When we come back, we'll talk about Tarek Saffiedine, and then we will either discuss middleweights, or we'll try to just Tarek Saffiedine, mid-tier middleweight cacophony, that is Natal versus Casey, and then we'll try to get to at least one heavy bag question if we have time after that. Financial support is fantastic, but there are other, even easier ways to support Heavy Hands. Perhaps the best is by spreading the word. We know our fan base. You're all cool, popular people with serious social media presences. You're tastemakers and trendsetters. okay, there are one or two of you that don't fit that description. You know who you are, but no matter what, you can always help us out by telling folks about the show. And you can also give us a positive rating and review on iTunes and Stitcher, things like that. We rely on word of mouth and positive feedback to grow and improve, so thank you very much for your time and your help. Now, back to the show. And we are back. We have just a little time left here, so let's try and cover our remaining topics in quick fashion. First of all, Tarek Saffiedine. What do you think about Tarek Saffiedine, Pat? He's been out for another year, over a year now, I think, since his only 2 UFC fights after becoming the last welterweight champion in Strikeforce history way back now in 2013. He's only fought twice since then. What do we make of him as a fighter?
I'm a big Tarek Saffiedine fan and have been for quite some time.
Me too.
I think Rory McDonald was a real rough matchup for him. But Saffiedine was competitive for the entirety of that fight up until the knockout. He is a dedicated leg kicker. I love the variety of setups that he has for his leg kicks. He doesn't have much power at all, but he's really, really, really good at it. He's a good counterpuncher. He's got a lot of ways of putting his low kicks on you, and that's basically his game. He's got good cardio. He's going to push a pace. And if you kind of let him get after it, he will just kick the shit out of your legs for 3 or 5 rounds. And, the flip side of that matchup, Jake Ellenberger, man, how the mighty have fallen. Like, he went from the cusp of a title shot to being, I think, 1-4 in his last 5.
Yeah.
1-3 in his last 4 and 2-5 in his last 7 or something like that. It's really ugly.
He had it's tough to remember how recent his ascension to possible title contention was. He had that the fight against Martin Kampmann was a massive upset, right? Where he had the Diego Sanchez fight, he had the Jake Shields win just before that. It was only in 2012 when he fought Jay Heron and Nate Marquardt that we were still saying, hey, couple good wins, Jake Ellenberger's up there. He's a dangerous power puncher. I think what happened is he's no longer working with Rafael Cordero. And even then, he was, I think a lot of people acknowledge, a difficult guy to work with, hard to get his head under control. And probably Rafael Cordero was better at keeping him confident than anybody else, which doesn't surprise me. And since then, he has not been able to do it. Where I think he comes into every fight these days with a lot of questions of how he can perform, and then every one of his doubts is just cemented by what the opponent does to him. It's for that reason that I think Saffiedine is kind of going to pick him apart, because not only is Saffiedine's not a powerful fighter, as you said, he can be tagged, he can be hit. Those are 2 dangerous things against Ellenberger, but he's very intelligent. He moves really well. He jabs really well out of both stances when he chooses to. Mixes a nice hook off of his jab, and he is an intelligent leg kicker, which means he's going to be slowly sapping the energy out of Jake Ellenberger's legs all night long. I agree with you. I think it's so fun to watch him set up his leg kicks. It's like watching a Thai leg kicker or a Kyokushin fighter who specializes in leg kicks, because in those rule sets, everybody knows how to stop leg kicks. So you have to be really crafty if that's going to be the thing you specialize in. And Saffiedine has come up against fighters who adapt to his leg kicks, and he keeps making them work. He will disguise them with punches. He will shove you back so you have to plant your weight. He will force you to block so your weight is on the leg that he wants to hit. He will kick lightly to determine how you react before even sitting down on one so he doesn't hurt himself if you happen to check. He's just very intelligent in how he puts those strikes together. I think it'll be really fun to watch him do that to Jake Ellenberger.
Yeah, it's rare to find a fighter who fights pretty much equally well out of both stances and does more or less the same things out of both stances. Yeah. Like most guys who switch regularly have particular things that they're more comfortable doing out of one than the other. I think TJ Dillashaw does pretty similar things from both stances, though he likes to kick a little more from southpaw. But I think Tarek Saffiedine is the most effectively ambidextrous fighter in MMA, where basically his game is jabs and low kicks, and he does both of those equally well with similar setups, just different angles in both stances. It's weird how much his game mirrors itself on both sides.
Yeah, and we tend to think of the low kicking specialists as being these guys who get their leg kick TKOs as being these really powerful kickers. The Mike Goldberg example is always Anthony Hardonk, but we've also got guys like Pat Barry came into the MMA scene as a leg kick TKO guy. Edson Barboza. These are all fast, hard hitters, and Saffiedine is not that. He's a different type. He's a cerebral leg kicker, and it's a lot of fun to see. So let's talk about middleweights, Pat, because we have just a delicious middleweight matchup happening on the undercard this weekend between Rafael Natal and Kevin Casey. It is the most middleweight fight of any middleweight fight that has ever happened. And I think we can actually have a genuinely interesting discussion about why middleweight fights are like this. Because there's a particular kind of matchup you only seem to get at the mid-tier of the middleweight division. And it's fights between guys who are pretty good at everything. They're certainly not bad, but they're not nearly good enough at any one thing to seem anywhere close to the elite of the division. They're either not athletic enough, or if they are, they have serious confidence issues or serious consistency issues. They're not potent finishers. Or if they are, they're not athletic. They have all of these limitations, or they are just good across the board and completely unspectacular. Why do you think that is? And why is it so fun to watch?
Well, so middleweight sits in a really weird spot where you have, demographically, you have enough guys who walk around, at 200, 205 pounds, somewhere in there, who can make the cut down to 185, that you have a large pool of guys who can fight at that weight. Unlike light heavyweight, where the pool of guys who walk around at 220, 225, 230, and who are reasonably athletic to make the cut down to 205, it's a much smaller pool, and it's smaller still at heavyweight. But it's not as deep as welterweight or lightweight or featherweight, where you have a lot of guys who walk around at 165 to 190 pounds who can make the cut to those weight classes.
And so the same class of fighter would not make it to the UFC.
Exactly, yeah. So you have enough guys who do it, but not so many that guys like Rafael Natal or Tom Watson can't make it to the UFC, and they're stuck on the regional scene getting blasted by a prospect every fourth fight.
The organization still needs them for depth, but they're not good enough to ever be top fighters. They'll maybe crack through the bottom of the top 15 or top 10 if they get one big win. But the fun thing is you get to see these guys fight each other. And I think it's so easy to talk about these like they're just god-awful fights. And obviously there's a little bit of irony to my appreciation for it, because I laugh when just saying Rafael Natal versus Kevin Casey, I giggle. Like it's a funny fight to me. But it's not like these are altogether bad fighters. They just don't mesh with the rest of the fights you see on the card, and there's so many of them in middleweight. So it's like a dirty little secret that MMA fans get to enjoy, where I genuinely love watching these middleweight fights.
Well, I think there's a fun style that underlies this, that like this particular stew of ingredients of pretty skilled, if we're being honest about it, skilled fighters, but who aren't terribly athletic, who don't necessarily hit particularly hard, but they've been in the UFC for long enough, they've been around MMA for long enough, they generally train with good camps, they have good coaches. I would imagine they're awesome training partners and awesome guys to have around for young fighters. They have a lot of depth of skill, so there's a very particular style of fight that comes out of this. They're well-rounded. There's nothing that they don't really know how to do, but they tend to be crafty. They tend to be good pace fighters, and they tend to be really, really good in the clinch. Like, this is kind of the stew of ingredients that goes into creating a whole subset of fun but under-the-radar fights.
Sure, yeah. Our friend of the show and Bloody Elbow co-worker of mine, Phil McKenzie, summed up the state of the middleweight division when I mentioned that this fight was just my everything on Twitter the other day. He said the blue-collar scrappers are now kingless, and there's an attempted BJJ guys with suspect gas tanks regicide. The shit is too real. And I love that you can just describe... Even if there's two subsets, you can describe a type of fighter in this division, and there are enough of them around that you know exactly who they're talking about. Like, if you've watched Tom Watson, you know he's describing Tom Watson when he says blue-collar scrappers are now kingless. And he describes Scott Askham. He has my favorite nickname for any fighter, Phil McKenzie. To him, Scott Askham is Mega Tom Ultra Watson, because he is just that exact fighter, but bigger and more powerful. And then we got the BJJ guys with suspect gas tanks. Like, these are defined types. There's enough of them in this division to know those kind of fighters, like Natal and Casey. I just think it's really kind of an interesting, weird, anomalous thing to have so many of these guys in one place in the UFC, and to have all of them fighting each other, where when you see, Natal fighting Chris Camozzi, and you see that fight only happened for the first time in September of 2014, it doesn't make sense. Like, how did Ed Herman and Tim Boetsch only just fight a week ago for the first time? How did that happen? It seems like that fight has been happening for decades.
But it's like there are like 15 of these guys.
Yeah, exactly. So they're just
like,
matching up all the time that you're like, I'm sure they fought, but they haven't.
Yeah, because at lightweight or welterweight, you're either rising or falling, right? Like the ranked guy, the guys that you would rank in those divisions between say 25 and 50, like you're either on your way out of the UFC or you're on your way up. There is no way to really like stick around as kind of a mid-level journeyman fighter in the UFC, because there are just too many guys, and there's too many guys on their way in, there's too many guys on their way out, there's just a lot more turnover. But at middleweight, you get all of these dudes like the Chris Kamotsis of the world, the kickboxers without any power who work at a good pace and fight really well in the clinch. Like that's a whole subset of dudes who fight at middleweight.
Yeah.
Like, and I don't know, I just love it. But there's a lot of craft to these guys' games, especially in the clinch, and there's just it's worth appreciating even if these guys never get your pulse up.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, and every once in a while it'll turn into a great. You would never expect Trevor Smith versus Ed Herman to be a great fight, but it was a barn burner. It was a really fun matchup. Every once in a while, because these are genuinely crafty guys, they do stick around at the UFC level for a reason. And I have a genuine appreciation for journeymen. Guys who are they're not elite, but they get by despite that. Despite lacking that athleticism or that next level specialization, they get by. And it just kind of indicates how crafty they are. So I do enjoy it. It may also be, as we kind of concluded before the show today, a bit of a survival tactic for analysts like us to keep our sanity. That I have to, at some point, just acknowledge that I like watching Ed Herman fight to justify the fact that I've seen it happen about a dozen times. Because if I wasn't doing this for a job, I don't think I would watch Ed Herman fight that many times. But I've seen it a lot, so I gotta basically conclude that I like it at some point. At some point, I've got to come up with a reason for why it keeps happening. So, it's a fun topic anyway, and maybe we can talk about it more in the future. Looking forward to the fight. I hope it's as fun or as terrible as it is going to be. I don't care. I will enjoy it no matter what. With that, why don't we move on to the heavy bag questions before we wrap up. And, you know what I forgot to do, Pat?
You forgot to talk about the sound effect before we use the heavy bag.
I forgot to talk about the sound effect because our first question is from Tej at TEEJ2727, and he asks, "Can you guys bring back the bit where Connor talks about playing the heavy bag sound effect before playing it?" Which was a classic bit for earlier episodes of the show that everybody loved and adored, and I forgot. So I'm gonna have to remember next week. Maybe you can remind me, and we can have a whole discussion about the sound effect before I play it. And we can just like go have
Yeah, I'm very disappointed that we forgot to do this.
Damn it!
This is a huge problem.
I'm so sorry, Teach. I was really hoping to look at that and say, "Hey, how was that, Teach? Was that? Did you enjoy that?" You didn't, obviously. It was a terrible time for you. So I promise I'll make it up to you. I will talk about it and ruin the effect of the sound effect as soon as I can. Should I play it a second time just to make it like out of place?
No, I think we're good.
Oh, okay.
I love that you just went ahead with it anyway. But, okay,
there was a silence. It needed to be filled. So our real question comes to us from David Bixenspan. And David asks us, what fighters have striking styles that are the most MMA specific, and which of them work best? He says, i.e. look or function least like something that would work in a single discipline, by which I suppose he means boxing, taekwondo, Muay Thai, something like that. So what do you think, Pat?
I think Rafael dos Anjos comes to mind as an example of a fighter whose striking style is very, very MMA specific.
Sure.
I think in large part because it relies so heavily on the cage. It's heavily adapted to the use of small gloves versus large gloves. Like his defensive movements are very MMA specific. I don't think that's not to say that they wouldn't work in another sport, but they are very, very, very well suited for MMA. His footwork is suited for MMA, for a cage that doesn't have any corners versus a ring, so on and so forth. I think at every level, his striking game is suited toward MMA.
I'm going to take a different tack here. And I'm going to use this as an opportunity to talk about the notion of something being MMA specific. Because I think we, as a fan community, are a little too fixated on this idea that things can be designed for MMA. which causes us to be a little too exclusive in some ways, right? Where for years and years everyone's like, oh, you do Muay Thai and Jiu-Jitsu, that's MMA, duh. And then we don't allow anyone with something unorthodox to come in. And then when something unorthodox works, we're like, oh, that's cleared for MMA now. Quickly, everyone throw front kicks, where suddenly it's part of the canon. Because somebody else has made it work. And that does exist in other martial arts and other sports as well, where things become popularized by big stars having success with an unusual tactic. But it's I think it's intensified in MMA by this idea that things only work when they are like officially approved to work. And for me in particular, when I do breakdowns, I bring up boxing all the time because I'm a big fan of boxing. I watch a lot of boxing, especially classic fights. And I've never, ever had trouble applying a boxing example to MMA. You know, when I talked about Holly Holm's punching mechanics, I compared her to Joe Louis. It works just fine because the way Joe Louis punches works for MMA as well as it does for boxing. You watch Joe Louis throw a right hand, how different is it really from the way Justin Gaethje throws a right hand? It's not really.
It's not really. And I think you raise a really, really excellent point there, right? That this is MMA. Yeah, I think that in large part we're limited by what we consider to be the accepted canon of MMA.
Yeah.
And now with that said, I think there are specific things that have more utility in MMA versus other combat sports. So first and foremost, like things that deal with level changes or play off of level changes are going to be more effective in MMA. So kicks with a rising arc, stepping knees, uppercuts, like those have different applications, if not necessarily more effective applications in MMA.
Sure. As does threatening a level change has more. You're not just worried about being jabbed to the body; you're worrying about being taken down. So you have to react differently as well.
Yeah, exactly. And defense has to change because you have smaller gloves, because you have to worry, because your hands need to be or are more likely to be in different positions to have to deal with different threats, i.e. level changes, takedowns, clinch entries, things like that. But for the most part, just about everything that you can do in another combat sport has some utility in MMA. It's a matter of figuring out what it is and how to use it.
Yeah, and it bothers me when we limit these things because you know, I can't tell you how many times I've read someone saying, oh, well, you can't slip like that in MMA, you'll get kicked in the head. And while, yes, it is very possible to get someone to slip into a head kick, it is something you have to get to happen. It's not an innate risk of slipping any more than getting hit by a looping shot is an innate risk of slipping and moving your head offline. You know, there are maybe more things to worry about, but we have a tendency to just write things off as not being approved for MMA. And, you know, I've been calling for the importance of upper body movement and head movement for years now. And now on this card, we've got guys like Jimmy Rivera and Anthony Johnson showing that, yes, that does in fact work very well while still understanding how to throw head kicks and how to avoid being kicked in the head. We saw Dominic Cruz do that against TJ Dillashaw. We see TJ Dillashaw do it against his opponents. We have all these guys using these things that were not approved a while back. And not to sound like some kind of know-it-all, but it doesn't surprise me that they work. I was just waiting for them to be accepted and for guys to start focusing on them, for the technique to reach that level where people were willing to try new things to get an edge. And so I think we might ultimately harm the development of the sport if we as fans, and also that includes the community fighters, it's still a relatively tight-knit community, and trainers and things like that, view it as a kind of thing where there's a certain specific type of thing that works in MMA and you have to do it that way. Because a lot of things can be made to work. I mean, look at the breadth of styles that there are in boxing, in other individual disciplines, right? You look at a guy, we talk about MMA fans love to say like, oh, he has a boxing stance. What's a boxing stance? You know, Joe Louis does not stand like Marlon Starling, does not stand like Wilfred Benitez, does not stand like Floyd Mayweather, does not stand like Willie Pep. None of these guys have anything in common in terms of the basic fundamentals of their stance because they're all adapted to their own unique skill sets, their own training backgrounds, and their goals in the ring. And MMA is the same way. You know, it's a lot more open than I think people give it credit for.
Yeah, that's it. When people talk about adapting things straight over, and this is what I was trying to get at earlier when I was discussing Anthony Johnson and the Dutch style, that like each one of these component skill sets has a tremendous amount of diversity to it. Like if we're talking about, you know, somebody coming out of American folk style collegiate wrestling, right? Like Phil Davis wrestles nothing like Ryan Bader does, right. Who wrestles nothing like Frankie Edgar did, who wrestled nothing like Daniel Cormier did. Like, all of those guys are coming out, like, they're all participants in this sport, and they share some techniques in common, but how they put those things together varies a great deal. Muay Thai is not a monolith. Boxing is not a monolith. The Dutch style kickboxing is not a monolith. Karate is not a monolith. Like, the kind of karate that George St. Pierre did and the kind of karate that Sage Northcutt did, or at least what they took from those, differed.
Yeah, compare Tarek Saffiedine to Conor McGregor or Lyoto Machida. All people with karate experience, none of them similar to each other. Not remarkably,
Yeah, exactly. I'm totally with that.
So, good question, though. Thank you very much, David, for asking. I'm so sorry again to teach that we forgot to awkwardly introduce the sound effect as if it was a third co-host. I will try to do that next week because I know how important it is to everyone's enjoyment of the show. Otherwise, thank you, everybody, for listening. Why don't we wrap things up with a few plugs? What do you got coming out this week, Patrick?
So I had an article come out on Tuesday that focused on the state of the UFC lightweight division as we move forward into 2016. Where we stand, who are the contenders, who's on the outside looking in, who are the prospects, and what we can look forward to at 155 pounds this year. And then I have my standard complete guide coming out. I think the day this podcast comes out. What are you doing, great. Connor?
Well, I've got my own Sherdog preview coming out, covering the entire card. So hopefully all the fights we didn't discuss on this week's episode, you can gain our collective thoughts by reading our respective previews. We tend to agree more often than not. And then I've got a long delayed but hopefully worthwhile epic, and I mean that in the traditional sense of it being really goddamn long, breakdown of Dominic Cruz versus TJ Dillashaw, all the technical details. By the way, Pat, I'm glad I didn't follow your advice not to die on that hill of the Dillashaw-Cruz scoring, because that was a real popular article I wrote about that fight belonging to Dillashaw. Really glad I decided. Not only did I get airlifted off the hill but and survive the battle, but I got a lot of really good discussion out of it. So my thanks to the MMA community for being so reasonable and willing to talk about scoring in our sport. And then I'm still trying to get this series of 2015 retrospectives going, so I keep saying I'm going to do it, but I'm really gunning for it this week. I'm not going to focus on this weekend's fights in an article, aside from the Sherdog preview. I'm really going to try and cover two of the best things of 2015. I'm looking to do Ioane and Jacek because I'm such a big fan, so look for that this week, but I guess you've learned not to expect too much from me by this point, because I think I brought it up on the last 2 episodes, and it has yet to be produced. So we'll see, but such is the life of an MMA analyst. Thanks again to everybody for tuning in. We hope you enjoyed this discussion. We're looking forward to the fights. Please enjoy Rafael Natal versus Kevin Casey as much as Pat and I are going to. The rest of the card looks pretty damn solid as well. Should be a good one. If you came here today for the finer points of face punching, you came to the right place. This has been Heavy Hands.